Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is about Biotech's Foot and Ankle Symposium. And, it's a part of the Biotech's education series, which has been going on with many events, and it's one of them. And this time it's going to be focusing only on foot and ankle. And we have 4 speakers, including myself. And 3 speakers are from various parts of South India. And we are going to focus on various conditions of talus and calcaneoplasty, ankle arthrodesis, and lateral ligament reconstruction, all done through arthroscopy. So I am very happy to invite the 3 speakers who have joined this meeting. First one is Dr. Atul Ghafoor. He's based in Calicut. He's an arthroscopic surgeon over there. He's going to share his experience about arthroscopic management of osteochondral dissections of talus. And next is Dr. Ashok Selvaraj from Chennai. He's an arthroscopic surgeon at MIOT in Chennai. He's going to share his experience on endoscopic calcaneoplasty for retrocranial bursitis, and he's going to give an overview of the calcane and spur and related pathologies. Next, I will be talking on arthroscopic ankle arthrodesis. And further to that, Dr. Rufus Vasantraj from Chennai Rela Institute is an arthroscopic surgeon over there, and he's going to share his experience on arthroscopic lateral ligament reconstruction, which is done arthroscopically and its outcome. So this is going to be the gist of the program today, and this program will continue for about an hour, with each speak going for about 10 to 15 minutes. We welcome for any discussions that you can either ask at the end of each speech, either by through chat or by asking direct questions. So
Recording in progress.
Let us start with the program. And shall I invite Dr. Atul Ghafoor to start with his speech? Abdul, are you ready for doing the share screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, is my screen visible, sir?
Yeah, very, very well visible. Please go on.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank sir and the biotech team for having given me this opportunity. Today, I'll be speaking about the osteochondral lesions of the talus. Osteochondral lesions of the talus, they are a group of disorders. It encompasses a broad terminology that involves osteochondral fractures, osteochondral dissections, and even So basically, an osteochondral dissecans is an aseptic separation of an osteochondral segment with gradual fragmentation of the articular cartilage. It is most commonly seen in youngsters between 20 and 30s of age, more seen in male, and in 10% of people it is seen bilaterally. The incidence of misdiagnosis or delayed diagnosis of osteochondral lesions is quite high. It is reported to be as high as 81% in the literature. So the talus is a peculiar bone in the human body, in that it has got almost 60% of its surface covered with cartilage. And the talar cartilage and the subchondral bone of the talus are highly prone to vascular insufficiency. So this is due to 2 reasons. The first thing is that in comparison to the other joints, other weight-bearing joints of the lower limb, the talar cartilage is only less than 1.2 millimeters thick, compared to 1.6 millimeters in the hip and 2.2 millimeters in the knee. And the second reason is that the arterial supply to the talar dome and the overlying cartilage is quite peculiar because it has got a retrograde vascular supply and there are few watershed areas. So both these factors are making talus more prone to development of osteochondral lesions. So the main reason for this is a specific traumatic episode, and you find that almost 90 to 95% of the lateral talar lesions are post-traumatic, and almost 60 to 65% of the medial talar lesions are post-traumatic. And it could be a single shear and a compression force, or it could be a repetitive microtrauma. So a small breach in the subchondral bone, it can progress to a bigger lesion by repetitive microtrauma or due to the hydrostatic mechanism that plays inside the ankle joint. And in the talus, 56%, that majority are seen in the posteromedial aspect, and almost 40% are seen in the anterolateral aspect. And the medial lesions are usually posterior, and the mechanism of injury is usually an inversion and plantar flexion. So you can just imagine it's a plantar flexion injury, and the posterior part of talus is hitching onto the tibial platform. So a medial lesion is posterior, it's more deep. And compared to the lateral lesions, which is actually a dorsiflexion injury, and hence the lesion is more anterior. The lateral lesions are more post-traumatic, as we described earlier. It is shallow. It is actually a small lesion most of the times. Patients usually present with pain and stiffness, and they could be localized tenderness at the site of lesion. And if it is a stage 4 lesion, they could even present with locking. Of course, radiographs are the first mode of investigation, but we tend to miss them if not properly looked for. So first thing is you need to have a high index of suspicion, and then the radiographs has to be properly taken, because if it is not a properly done radiograph, you miss it most of the times. So as seen in this x-ray, this is a young chap who had a severe ankle sprain. He was having severe pain for almost 1 year. So the first x-ray seems to be quite normal. But then the X-ray taken almost after 16 months shows a well-defined osteochondral desiccants. And hence MRI is more sensitive, and it has got a sensitivity of almost 96%. And it is also useful for distinguishing a stage 2 from a stage 3 lesion. I'll describe what is a stage 2 and stage 3, because a stage 2 can be still given a trial of conservative management. So this becomes quite important. A CT scan is important for a preoperative planning, because it helps in assessing the amount of subchondral bone loss. It helps in assessing the exact location of the lesion. So the most commonly followed classification is that described by the Bennett-Hutty. The stage 1 is an irregularity or a softening of the cartilage. Stage 2, there is a breach in the articular cartilage, and there is a definite fragment which is not detached. And at stage 3, the fragment is completely detached, but it has got some some attachment to the origin. And the stage 4 is a pure loose body. There are several other classifications which have come up lately, described by Ferkel and Heppel. So these are based on CT and MRI. Arthroscopy is the gold standard of diagnosis. Now the treatment depends upon the duration of the illness and the grade of the lesion. Also, it depends upon the size, symptoms of the patient, and presence of coexistence of an arthritis. A stage 1, as we described earlier, it is just a softening of the cartilage. It gives good results with conservative management. Stage 2 can also be given a trial of conservative management. You can wait up to 6 to 8 weeks, and literature shows that most of them gives good result. Whereas a stage 3 and stage 4 warrants a surgical intervention. So when we say non-operative treatment, we mean to say that you need to immobilize with a cast or a brace, and you have to give a protected weight bearing for 6 to 12 weeks, and gradually start free range of movement, and then you need to give good ankle rehab. And because we see that physio recent literature, many others giving a good trial of non-operative management in the initial period, because they agree that a delay in the operative treatment resulting from a trial of non-operative therapy does not affect the final results of a later surgical management. So especially in stage 1 and stage 2, it is worthwhile to give a trial of conservative management. Certain others have even tried to manage stage 3 as well, but the literature support for that is not evident. Now coming to the surgical management, for lesions, for displaced lesions more than 1 centimeter, you have to approach it just like any intra-articular fracture. So it is best fixed with headless screws or bioabsorbable pins. And if it is just a fleck of cartilage without any bony involvement, you can just remove it, the cartilage piece arthroscopically. Now coming to the chronic lesions, which is our topic. So there are 2 main management options. The first thing is bone marrow stimulation, and the second thing is cartilage replacement. So bone marrow stimulation involves abrasion chondroplasty, microfracture, and subchondral drilling. So these are marrow stimulation procedures. And when you come to cartilage replacement, it involves bone marrow aspirate concentrate, autologous chondrocyte implantation, osteochondral autografts or allografts, and arthroscopic juvenile allograft. So the most commonly done procedure is marrow stimulation procedures. It is basically suitable for lesions that are less than 1 centimeter in diameter and less than 60 millimeter deep. So here, the subchondral bone is perforated to allow progenitor cells from the bone marrow to infiltrate into the lesion, and these eventually form fibrocartilage at the defect. The success rate of microfracture and drilling is found to be much better than abrasion because both these procedures penetrate deep into the subchondral bone. And obviously, success of arthroscopic procedures much higher than the open procedure. The benefits of marrow stimulation procedures are maintained over time. So this describes the basic procedure what we need to do. We need to debride the cartilage properly. The unstable cartilage has to be identified and removed. The lesion has to be defined properly, and then microfracture has to be done quite precisely. So you can see that it has to be adequately gapped. You shouldn't end up in putting too many microfractures close because that would lead up in creating a big crater, or the microfractures can collide and give rise to a big fracture. And another important thing is that the microfracture has to go perpendicular to the surface, because if it goes in an oblique direction, it can collide with the adjacent pit. So this is one of the case which we did recently. This is a medial lesion. So this was a stage 3 lesion, and oh my God, I'm sorry, I missed the, I had an edited video. So I'll just tell, so I think you can see, yeah, so this is the lesion which we see. Okay, so you can see the cartilage, the adjacent cartilage, which is highly unstable. So the first step is probing and finding out the extent of the true lesion. So this portion of the cartilage was found to be unstable, and so you need to debride that. You need to remove the part of the cartilage. You shouldn't end up in debriding quite a large area, but then the fibrillated area, the unstable area, has to be removed. You can use a combination of shavers or punches or even curettes to clear off the unstable cartilage. So you need to have multiple devices. You need to have small punches, and you need to be quite patient because it is not quite. It is quite difficult, especially when you try to get it over the edges. You need to have a good assistant who would help you with the joint distraction as well. So you can even use curettes to remove the unstable cartilage. Yeah. Now, once that is done, you can use small chondropics to create the fracture. So you need to precisely position the joint so that you could get it perpendicular. So as I told earlier, placing the microfractures is quite important. So you need to define the lesion. You need to know where all you are going to put the microfracture, because you shouldn't end up in creating a large crater. It has to be well spaced, and you can even deflate the tunicate and see for the bleeding or the bone marrow coming from the deeper lesion. And you need to do a thorough scopy to find out whether there is an adjacent lesion as well. So this is just to show how we do a distraction. We can have a ready-made distractor, but this is what I use in my OT. This is a bandage, so it can be placed this way. It actually gives a very good traction. Either you can tie to your waist, and you can just lean onto the ankle, or you can ask your assistant to give a traction. See, because here my assistant is traction, and we can do the procedure quite easily. Now coming to retrograde drilling, this can be done for lesions that have an intact overlying cartilage, and the retrograde drilling is better modality that penetrates the necrosed subchondral bone without disturbing the overlying cartilage. So if a specific lesion demands that, this is a good option. You can you can place the you can identify the lesion, and you can precisely locate it with the help of a C-arm. Now that's all with the marrow stimulation procedure, and I'll describe a few thoughts on the cartilage replacement as well. The BMAC, bone marrow aspirate concentrate, is a well-described procedure for the knee joint, but the literature supports for talar lesions is quite limited. Here what we do is we aspirate the bone marrow with the help of a centrifugator. You centrifuge the bone marrow aspirate, and then this is the activated float scaffold, which is placed over the prepared site. The site is prepared, and then you place it over the lesion. The other option is autologous chondrocyte implantation. This is basically a quite expensive procedure. This is a two-stage one. In the first stage, you harvest the graft from the talar neck. You do going arthroscopically. You take some cartilage cells from the talar neck. You can even get the graft from the knee as in the primary procedure. And then the cartilage graft is sent for culturing. And maybe after a few weeks, you get a good amount of cartilage culture. And on a second procedure, you place that on the prepared lesion. So this is basically useful if the lesion is more than 1 centimeter. But if it is a deep lesion, then you would need a bone graft as well. The cost and the need for two surgeries are the main concerns regarding autologous chondrocyte implantation. Now coming to osteochondral autografts or allograft. This is actually a very good procedure when you have a failed case, when you have done a microfracture, and when the patient is not still comfortable occasionally. This is one procedure which we can suggest. So this is helpful in lesions that are larger than 1.5 centimeter and deeper than 6 millimeter. So you get autologous grafts. This is how you prepare the lesion. This is the OCD lesion, and you have to prepare it. You have to prepare the lesion because this is how you get the plugs from the donor site. So you need to prepare the recipient site in such a way that to place the donor plugs. And grafts are usually harvested from the distal medial trochlear, which is a non-articulating part of the knee joint. The graft is usually 6 to 10 millimeter based on the exact lesion, the talar lesion, and based on that we take the graft. And it has to be at least 10 to 15 millimeters because it is essential for the cancellous bone integration. You can see you have this diagram shows the importance of preparation of the recipient site. You have to adequately prepare the site because you shouldn't end up in creating a very prominent graft. It has to be in flush with the surface. And another important thing is that you have to prepare the defect site perpendicular. So this gives a very stable and a sturdy graft. Another advantage is that it is the hyaline cartilage, original hyaline cartilage of the joint. Whereas in a microfracture, what we get is a inferior fibrocartilage. And for a very large lesion, you can use an allograft. So this has to be got from a fresh allograft or a fresh frozen allograft. So the main issue is the availability as well as the cost factor. Now the latest addition to the list is particulated juvenile allograft, cartilage allograft. So cartilage has got from deceased donors aged from newborn to 13 years. So the juvenile allograft, it has shown to possess copious cellular activity, and it results in formation of abundant extracellular matrix. So the harvested cartilage, they are placed on the defect site, and it is secured with the help of a fibrin glue. So there are many studies are coming up, and they show good results. So post-operatively, you need to give compression dressings and immobilization, and passive mobilization has to be started as soon as pain allows. So we always advise our patients to have this boot so that you can immobilize it at times, and the patient can do passive mobilization that enhances cartilage healing and vascularity. And after 4 to 6 weeks, you start torus weight bearing, and full weight bearing is started after 8 to 10 weeks. Balance training and proprioception is very important for any ankle case, because usually along with osteochondral dissecans, you find some amount of ankle instability as well. So strengthening and proprioception are very important. So in a nutshell, what we for asymptomatic osteochondritis dissecans, how you can approach is that you have to see whether the cartilage is intact. If the overlying cartilage is intact, the best procedure with you is retrograde drilling. And now, when the overlying cartilage is unstable, you have to look at the size. If the size is less than 1.5 centimeter, the best procedure is microfracture. When the size is more than 1.5 centimeter, if it is a contained lesion, you can use the described replacement procedure, such as the best procedure is allograft. You can even use you can use osteochondral autologous graft. That is the best procedure. So thank you. Subramanian sir, I think you are muted.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul. Very nice presentation. Yeah, I think you concisely told about everything about the WORDS procedure.
Thank you.
So, is there any questions in the chat box first? Have you done MRI after doing WORDS procedure for any of your case?
Actually, I have one case where I had a chance to do a relook arthroscopy.
Ah, all right, okay.
So in that case, I had an MRI as well. Actually, the patient had a second episode. He somehow developed another loose body. So we were suspecting a second lesion, but then it was almost after 1 year. He was a sports person, so the MRI showed good healing. But what I feel is, I got few literature. We say that we get hyaline cartilage after OATS, but then after 1 year when I relooked, I think that when comparing with the other cartilage, it is not as good. The patient was doing very good. So one interesting literature I saw that actually the hyaline cartilage gets converted to fibrocartilage, which in the plug which we transfer.
Did you take a biopsy of that?
I should have done. Biopsy was not taken. This study particularly shows that biopsy has done, and they say that even if we transfer a hyaline cartilage, over time it converts to fibrocartilage.
What you are doing is absolutely true, because none of these WORDS procedure or ACA are 100% satisfactory result. All of them come around like 80 to 90%, and the microfracture comes around 45 to 50%. So we can improve from microfracture to WORDS by doing some percentage of outcome. But I think, as you say, none of them really come to like same like hyaline cartilage like other cartilages. There will be some fibrous element will be there, but it's better than the microfracture. That's all.
Being microfracture being the gold standard, so always we're doing a better job by doing other OATS or ACI. It's always good for the patient. But the patient should understand it will never be normal. That's a take-home message.
What's your take on any stem cell therapies? Do you give any injections in addition to this, like PRP, CSR?
Along with this, you mean to say along with this?
Yes. When you
On top of WORDS.
Not for WORDS, but microfracture.
I don't think there is any literature support for that, but there are few people who try that before the surgical intervention. Before surgery, along with the conservative management, many people have tried. I think Mandip Dhillon sir has got a good paper. He has got a good series. He says that they do well with PRP.
Okay.
I think on top of votes, we don't give PRP or any other injection. But if you do on separately, in isolation, then you can do microfracture, and then on top of it, you can either inject BMAC or any other PRP, whatever, okay, for it to regrow. But I don't know whether any of you have experience of ACI, autologous chondrocyte implantation.
We do, sir. We do on a regular basis.
You're doing it, isn't it? Yeah.
We do.
And where you take the biopsy of cartilage and
Yeah. Bring it back.
And what is your
The
feedback?
clinical results are very good, sir. Clinically, the patients do really well, but we have not had an occasion where we have to go back in and look at the cartilage. So we had on 2 occasions where we had to go and relook. One patient had a Ward's procedure done. It healed very well. What I'm talking is in the knee aspect. Another patient had a chondral fracture following a patellar dislocation in the lateral femoral condyle. So in this, I fixed it was purely a chondral fracture, not an osteochondral fracture. But in spite of that, I fixed it. But I gave a BMAC injection also to seal it around.
Okay.
So the patient developed stiffness. At 3 months, I went back and saw, because I thought maybe it wouldn't have healed. But to my surprise, it had healed completely.
But,
maybe the BMAC helped with it. I'm not sure, but it was only purely a chondral fragment which I fixed with 2 biocompression screws. It had really beautifully. So these are 2 occasions. ACI clinically, whoever we have done, they are doing really well. So our choice where other options are not there, the patient willing for 2 procedures, we always strive to do them for ACI.
What's your take on retrograde drilling?
I don't have any personal experience with retrograde drilling.
Okay, because I was with Dr. David Rajan, so we used to do a retrograde drilling, which is very common.
Okay.
So it actually works. All these fibrin glows and all do work.
Okay.
Retrograde drilling we have done in knee joints quite often, but in talus also you can do it, no problem.
Yeah.
And it's exactly same like revascular is in under the subchondral area, where you're trying to make multiple holes over there so that the vascular channels will open up and help for the whole cartilage to make it heal better. Yeah. And it will be much useful for type 2 kind of patient.
I used a paper from Auto 1 at that time. Maybe I'll start it later. About retrograde drilling for talus.
Yeah. I think to summarize, OCD is definitely a controversial thing in management, and there are a lot of ladders in this. You're starting from microfracture and then go to BMAC, PRP, and then WORS, and then ACI. So this is the ladder in managing the outcome of each procedure has got its own value. From microfracture about 40% to 50%, and ACI coming around 90%. So this is what the message for audience from this particular speech. If there are no other speech, no other doubts, and shall we go to the next talk?
I think I can go.
You okay to go to the next talk?
Yes, I'm
okay, fine. So in that case, shall I invite Dr. Ashok Selvaraj from MIOT to share his experience on endoscopic calcaneoplasty. Can you start sharing your screen?
Is my screen visible now? Is my screen visible? Can I continue?
You are visible. Continue.
Yeah, okay. Good evening. At the outset, I'd like to thank Biotech, Dr. Ken Subramaniam, for giving me this opportunity to talk on endoscopic calcaneoplasty in this webinar. And also like to thank Mr. Vinod in Biotech for the opportunity. So basically, I'm going to talk about endoscopic calcaneoplasty, the surgical technique, where it is helpful, how to do it, and when done right, it gives excellent results. So first, we have to all be aware of something called Haglund's syndrome. So this endoscopic calcaneoplasty is basically a procedure done in the hind foot. Hind foot basically has the Achilles tendon, and there are 2 types of lesions which happen in the Achilles tendon. It could be an insertional tendinopathy, or it could be a non-insertional tendinopathy. So if it is an insertional tendinopathy, it may be associated, there may be reasons for it to happen. like the Haglund syndrome. What is Haglund syndrome? Haglund syndrome is basically it's a triad of enlargement of the posterior lateral calcaneum, basically what we commonly call as an Haglund's deformity, with associated retrocalcaneal bursitis, which is between the posterior calcaneus and the anterior aspect of the insertion of the Achilles tendon, which due to the irritation of this bone, it leads to degenerative changes in the tendon, leading to the tendinopathy at the insertion. It is very important clinically to differentiate between whether it's an insertional tendinopathy or it's a non-insertional tendinopathy, because the management varies completely. So these are the basic outside we have to know very clearly. So what does an insertional tendinopathy patient presents to us? With an Haglund syndrome, they usually present to us with a painful red irritated heel, and they usually have pain early in the morning, what we call as a startup pain. They wake up in the morning, they feel have pain in the posterior aspect of the foot. And in patients with a chronic condition, they usually present with palpable and visible osseous prominence, like this picture. So all these patients, when we investigate, the first investigation choice is for us to do an X-ray. Lateral X-rays are very important because we can assess the morphology of the Haglund, if it is a cause for pain, and to look for any calcification in the Achilles tendon. Because we have to, when we know that it's an insertional Achilles tendinopathy, we have to know whether it's an acute condition or it's going on for a long time. It's a chronic condition. So if it is a chronic condition going for a long time, the patient may have some calcification in the Achilles tendon, which is very important in the treatment aspect. And also, if you look closely, we will be able to see in the posterior aspect what is called as Kager's fat pad. It's a fat pad in the just anterior to the Achilles insertion above the calcaneum. It is a triangular in shape. If this is disrupted, if this Kager's fat pad is disrupted, this is an indirect sign there is a retrocalcaneal bursitis, which has been proven by multiple research. But MRI is the investigation choice in these conditions. Why? Because we can assess the morphology of the Achilles tendon, where we have to know whether there is any degeneration, there is any intrasubstance tear, and also to confirm the diagnosis that it is an insertional tendinopathy rather than a non-insertional tendinopathy, and also to look for any associated lesions like bursitis, edema of the calcaneum, or if the pain in rare occasions is due to some other pathology. So MRI should be done in all patients to confirm our diagnosis so that we can treat them accordingly. So for any Achilles lesions, first line of management is conservative management. In acute cases, the NSAIDs, the anti-inflammatories, helps, and ask them to do activity modification in such a way that reduces the load on the Achilles tendon. And we give a soft cushion pad for elevation of the heel, which unloads the Achilles tendon so that allows it to heal. And most importantly, put them on a stretching exercise for the gastrocnemius soleus complex. So this works very well for a non-insertional tendinopathy. It is worthwhile stretching those muscles. And once the pain settles, it's important to strengthen the gastrocnemius soleus muscle by eccentric exercises, which also helps. And there are many papers which have shown a role for PRP and also steroids in these conditions, even though it's limited. If the condition is an acute condition, the patient is presenting with retrocalcaneal bursitis as the primary pathology, local steroid injection into the bursa or PRP will help. But if the issue is in the insertion of tendon and tendinopathy is severe, the injections may not help. We should take care that we don't inject into the tendon, which may lead into rupture. So injections can be given for correct acute exacerbations, but should be given only in the bursa. So the Haglund's deformity can be stage 3, stage 1, 2, and 3. This staging is basically based on the amount of the tendon involved. If the patient has an insertional tendon Haglund syndrome, but the tendon involvement is not much, then it is stage 1. In these cases where there is a Haglund deformity, the tendon involvement is not much, particularly there is no calcification in the tendon, then these are the ideal candidates for endoscopic calcaneoplasty. Well done endoscopic calcaneoplasty in these patients uses very good results. And stage 2, stage 3 is based on moderate involvement of the tendon. And in these cases, we have to need another, so just calcaneoplasty alone won't be enough. They may need a additional ZX osteotomy to reorient the calcaneum to unload the tendon. In severe cases where the tendon is severely involved, there may be a partial rupture of the tendon and there is a abnormal calcification. Just doing calcanoplasty will not be enough. We may have to repair the tendon or we may have to do an FHL transfer. So when you have to do a calculation, which is better, whether it's open is better or endoscopic. It has been proven by multiple studies that endoscopic calculum is much better than open calculum, because after you do open calculum, you have to protect the wound from healing, which may lead to long periods of immobilization and delay in recovery. The patient, because of that, may develop adhesions and scar formation, which may lead to pain and stiffness. And with all surgeries in the hind foot, where the blood supply to the skin is not good, and especially in a diabetic patient also, there is always a risk of wound healing and infection. So if any procedure can be done minimally invasive or an endoscopy, an arthroscopy in the foot and ankle, it's always much better. It gives faster and excellent results. So endoscopic calculoplasty is always better than the open procedure. So I'll illustrate the technique of endoscopic calculoplasty based on a case. This is a 60 years female who presented to the clinic with 9 months heel pain for 9 months. She had tried all the conservative management with heel raise analgesia with no relief. She also had an injection of PRP few months back with no relief. She continued to have pain. The MRI clearly shows that she has a Haglund's deformity with a retrocalcal bursitis and relatively minimal to moderate degeneration of the Achilles tendon. If this was a young patient in the age less than 40, just doing an endoscopic calcanoplasty won't be enough for this patient. Since she is 60 and her active life is relatively less, we opted to do just endoscopic calcanoplasty for her. So endoscopic calcanoplasty can be done either in supine or prone position. Prone position is very ideal in that it gives us better orientation, and also if you have to do open the posterior aspect of the hind foot, it is always easy to do that, and it should always done under C-arm control. In the right picture, you can see that the leg in prone position should be hanging outside the table, so that it will be easy for us to maneuver. And once you have positioned the patient and drape, then under the C-arm guidance, we pass a K-wire at the midpoint of the posterior calcaneus to mark the amount of Haglund's deformity you are planning to represent. This is very important, and for people who are starting to do this in the initial stages, this gives us a good benchmark when you're doing endoscopy. And it's always better to leave the wire little proud in the anterior aspect. I'll tell you why when we do the when I show the video. So once we have done that, next important part and most crucial part in the endoscopic calcanoplasty is the portals. We make a medial and a lateral portal which are just adjacent to the Achilles tendon, and it is to be important that it is right at the upper rim of the posterior and superior tip of the calcaneum. It's very, very important, and if you need it, we can use the C-arm to mark the superior edge of the posterior aspect of the calcaneum. If our portal is even slightly higher than the level of the posterior superior edge, then it will be very difficult for it to do a complete resection. Or if it's slightly higher, the space with which we work is very small. So for us to reach the posterior inferior aspect of the calcaneum will be very difficult. So we had one case where we had a slightly high and we had to go to a lot of struggle. So it's very important. You can use the C-arm and you have to be absolutely spot on and getting the portal right. Should be as posterior and as superior at the edge as possible. So I'll just go on to the video. So the patient is in the prone position. So we can use our body, abdomen over the heel, over the foot. With this, we control the dorsiflexion, plantar flexion of the ankle so that our hands are free to do the arthroscopy. So, and we also mark the portals where we want to do that. So, after infiltration of the portals, we make the skin incision at the mark point and we don't go deep. Then, using artery forceps or a blunt trocar, we penetrate and feel for that Achilles tendon and try to go below the Achilles tendon, and we do a horizontal release. Once we feel we are in the retrocalcaneal space, then we insert the 4 mm arthroscope. So once we are inside the 4 mm arthroscope, we can either make the medial portion inside out technique using a trocar, or we can use an outside in technique using the illumination of the arthroscope. Sorry. So with the arthroscope. So once you are in, we should always be aware of the position where we are in. We should be aware that the Achilles tendon is above and the posterior calcaneum is below. And once we make the medial portal, which will only with the skin incision, we put an artery inside and open up, and we have to identify we are in the retrocalcaneal space. Once we are there, then we use a 4 mm or a 3.5 mm shaver inside and start doing the burst section. It's important to keep the shaver blade parallel to the Achilles tendon and also Kupton calcaneum, so that you don't injure either of them. Once we have to be very patient in these steps and slowly do the burst excision and do the fat pad. We should alternate with the probe and palpate for the posterior border of the calcaneum. Once we identify the calcaneum, we can see that whitish structure, that is the cartilage coverage over the calcaneum. We have switched portals and we have to do the bursectomy complete, and we have to complete the burst. Once you have done the bursectomy completely, you get the exposure of the Haglund's deformity. And once we expose the Haglund's deformity, we slowly remove the cartilage covering over the Haglund's. Once you're done, then we focus on the anterior aspect. Like we left the cava prominent, we try to identify the cava. Once the cava comes into view, we now have the idea of how anterior we can go for our resection. So cava access the anterior aspect, and we have the triangle in which we have to work to remove the amount of calcaneum has to be removed. So we have the medial and the lateral edge, and once we remove the cartilage cap over the Haglund's deformity or the posterior calcaneum exostosis, we are well aware how much bone we have to remove. Once we are aware of these things, we are identify the medial, lateral, and the anterior edge, then we can start the resection of the Haglund's deformity. We can either use a ball tip burr or a 4 mm acronizer. We start from the center. That's always a good thing. We start at the center to know that we know the amount of depth we have to go to do the resection. We go till we expose the cava. So once we are reached till the cava, we know that amount of depth we have to remove. Then we do resection on either side of the cava. We have to be very slow and doing the resection because the space what we have is very less, and it's preferable not to use any electrocautery inside or arthrocar inside, because the heat generated is very high, which may damage the Achilles tendon. So slowly we resect the bone, making sure that the shaver or the resector is away from the Achilles tendon, so that we will not injure that. Once we have done that, we go into the posterior inferior aspect of the calcaneum and create a plane between the Achilles tendon and the posterior aspect of the calcaneum. So we can see that I am able to create a plane there. This is the impinging part which has to be removed. Once we identified that, then we start resecting from the medial or the lateral aspect using a ball tip burr. Slowly we start resecting this posterior inferior aspect of the burr. So like I said, if your portal was too high, doing a resection here will be very difficult, because you will not able to get the angle to go into the posterior inferior aspect of the resection. This is the most important aspect of the resection, because this is the most impinging part which causes symptoms for the patient. If you don't resect this, the patient will continue to have pain even after. This is the most crucial part, and we can see that the foot is protecting the Achilles tendon on the right side. So once you have done that, we deepen the resection till the level of the cava, and it's important to switch portals on either side so that the completion can be done on either the medial and also on the lateral aspect. And we can see that with patient resection, we have removed the bone on either side. And once we are done with the freers, we confirm that our resection is adequate, and there is the Achilles tendon is not impinging, we dorsiflex and plantar flex and confirm the same. Once that is finished, we debride the remaining part of the Achilles tendon to remove any residual tissues. Once all this is finished, we always have to confirm that we have done a complete resection with a CM picture. Once we're done that, we remove the cane and close the wound. So that's how our resection is complete. So in these cases, since we have done a bony resection, these patients tend to have an hematoma in that area. So it's always advisable to keep the limb elevated for them at least for a week. I allow them only to partial weight bear for the first 2 weeks with crutches. Once the pain and swelling settles and the patient is comfortable, we can gradually move on to full weight bearing. They should not wear any shoes or any structure which will impinge on the posterior aspect for 6 weeks. Open slippers are good. They can return to athletic and normal activities in 12 weeks from surgery. But these patients, you can notice within 2 weeks of time, they'll have good pain relief and they'll be raring to go and do all this structure, because we always temper their excitement. Because if they walk and they bear weight, they will tend to develop any hematoma in that operated area. No need to keep any drain for them. So we should, if we're treating patients with a problem, we should be aware of all the procedure which is possible for them, and we should be ready to do that. A case in point, this is a 40-year-old soccer coach who has been having pain in his heel for past 1 year. He has had multiple injections in his ankle. A month back, he suddenly was not able to run. So he came to the clinic and found that he has a chronic insertional tendinopathy, partial tear of the Achilles tendon. You can see in the MRI clearly that the anterior aspect of the Achilles tendon is torn. He has a retrocalcaneal bursitis and a Haglund's deformity. In these cases, just doing a calcaneoplasty will not be enough. We have to repair that Achilles tendon. If it is not repairable and if it is degenerative, then we may have to do a tendon transfer. So in this case, what did I do? These patients are not ideal for an arthroscopic surgery. So we did an open procedure in prone position. So once we exposed, we did a Achilles tendon splitting procedure. We were able to expose the Haglund's deformity and bursitis. We did an open resection. Once we had done the resection, we found that the Achilles tendon was not of good quality. Just repairing alone will not help in an athletic guy like for in a particular soccer coach. So we harvested his flexor hallucis tendon. We prepared it and reattached it with the bio screws. So we reattached that. Once we reattach that, it's important in open that we have to do the section of the posterior superior calcaneus on the medial lateral aspect. Once we've done that and reattach the flexor hallucis tendon, then we go ahead and repair the remaining Achilles tendon using a couple of anchors. So once we have done that, these patients are put on a plaster for 3 weeks and also followed up for total plaster 6 weeks, then on an air cast boot for another 6 weeks. So they're protected for 3 months. By 6 months, he started running. So in conclusion, it is very important to get the correct diagnosis and stage the disease in the case of Achilles tendon pathology. Most of the patients respond to conservative management and they do well, and we have to try at least 6 months of conservative trial before thinking of any surgery. Endoscopic calcaneoplasty is an excellent procedure done for the right patient in the right way, and it's very important to do adequate resection. If you do an adequate resection, patients have excellent outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashok. It was a nice presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Any questions? I think there is one in the chat box. You can see it.
Yes, sir. Stop sharing.
Any role for prolotherapy? Somebody has asked. P.D. Hariharan has asked. Prolotherapy in retrocalcaneal bursitis.
I have no experience in that, so I'm not a right person for answer that.
I think what they mean by prolotherapy is injecting some irritant saline or like that.
Okay. And
I don't do also. So
based on the literature, what I went through, sir, all this injection therapy, they have a role in the non-insertional tendinopathies. So what they do is in high volume injection therapy. They already HVIT. So they give high volume injection therapies. They can give just normal saline or just lignocaine or in combination with steroids. So these are called high volume injection therapies. They have a role in non-insertional tendinopathies, provided they are not given in the tendon. So they say it works to an extent, but I have no experience in that.
I think other than steroid occasionally and PRP we inject.
Yes.
We don't have any experience on injecting any other substances.
Yes.
Any of the other panel members have injection of anything in the vitrecalculum bursa, like like a saline, hypertonic saline, or any other irritant, which can help to do fibrosis over there.
No, sir.
Yes, I guess none of them probably.
So I have had patients who had an injection coming back with the Achilles tendon rupture. So that is, I think, quite.
That is quite common with steroids also.
Any injections which is given, if they are not given in the retrocalcaneal space, there's a high chance of rupture, because with all our patients, they go at a very late stage where the tendon quality is not good. So just need a tipping point where you give an injection which leads to a tendon rupture. They usually come back the tendon rupture. So it's not advisable unless you are absolutely sure in giving the retrocalcaneal space. It's not advisable to give an injection in that area. Most of them usually they respond to good physiotherapy, where you stretch the gastrocnemius soleus muscles properly, and then you put them on an eccentric muscle strengthening exercise, Achilles muscle strengthening, gastrocnemius soleus strengthening exercise. Most of them they do well. That's it.
Dr. Ashok, can I ask you something?
Please.
Okay, so if you have a combination of insertion, if you have a calcific tendinitis along with
Okay.
what would you?
Okay, I think that's the thing. So if the patient has a calcific tendinitis, and if the MRI you are able to quantify the size of the calcific tendinitis, if it is a small calcific, because in the patient which I did first, she has a small calcific point there, but in MRI it was very small. That was not symptomatic, so we ignored for her age. Okay, but if it is slightly more proximal in the tendon, then we have to make a call. If it is the amount of surface area it is taking over in the Achilles tendon. If you fail, if you can just make a split in the tendon, just enucleate a calcific part, and then you can repair and get away with it. You can do that. Do an endoscopic calcaneoplasty, then do that. Otherwise, if you feel it is quite big, if the Achilles tendon started calcifying, that means the disease is in a chronic phase. That means there is some degeneration in the Achilles tendon. So just doing calcaneoplasty, which is the cause for the problem per se, will not cure her about. In those cases, if the calcific tendinitis size is big, then we have to go for open procedure like I did. Open, remove the calcify, see the status of the tendon. If the tendon status is good, you repair that. Otherwise, you have to go ahead and do an FHL transfer along with it.
I think that should be a great take-home message for you. Need to have a good clinical evaluation.
Yeah, that is very important.
To assess whether the patient's symptom is due to the insertional calcification or
Yes.
due to Hagelin.
Yeah, true.
Even just as we told, in early cases, if you are addressing the Hagelin, you can see that the calcification getting resolved if the patient is not symptomatic.
Yes, true, definitely. Thing is, in the literature what we go through, one of the contraindication for endoscopic calcaneoplasty is if there is calcification in the Achilles tendon. So if there is calcification in the Achilles tendon, the guide benchmark what is, if it involves more than 25% of the width of the Achilles tendon, then you should not go ahead do an endoscopic calcaneoplasty alone. You have to treat that calcification also, either by debridement, enucleation, and if that is not enough, and if there is more than 50% involvement of the Achilles tendon, then we have to do repair, or you have to do a tendon transfer also along.
Great. If you don't mind, one more thing. How would you decide on the amount of bone that has to be resected?
The thing is, you have to reach till the insertion point of the Achilles tendon. Okay. So if you see in my video, we remove the bone. At the end, we see that just till the insertion point of the Achilles tendon. So the posterior aspect of the calcaneus can be divided into three parts. The upper part where the Hagelin deformity is there, the middle third and the lower third. The Achilles tendon gets inserted in the middle third and the lower third junction. So where the angle of the Hagelin's deformity comes down and meets with the vertical part of the calcaneum, that is a posterior inferior aspect of the calcaneum. So at that point, the insertion starts. So if you're seeing my video, you could see me that I'm probing with a freeze. I had done that before also. You have to see the posterior inferior aspect and see if that part is impinging on the Achilles tendon by doing dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. So in dorsiflexion, if that part is impinging, then you have to remove that. Till you feel that at dorsiflexion, that posterior superior aspect is not impinging on the Achilles tendon. So it's a balance. You keep doing it, you will get to the point.
So, and I think your technique of keeping the caver is
yeah.
What I understand is that you need to one another technique is that you should get the pitch angle right. You have the low. So if you can place the caver parallel to that,
okay,
that gives a much more precise. Most of the time, we tend to under do the procedure.
Yeah, that's why going rather
long-term studies we see that later maybe 6 years, 10 years down the lane, many of these patients coming back with almost the same symptom. And there was one, I don't remember, it was Professor Panjwabi, someone. They say that it is always better to err onto the other side. You have to shouldn't end up in resecting less bone. So when you have a chance, you have to do it.
Yeah, the thing is, in calculoplasty, it's very important to know that we have to find the right balance. The thing is, why they switched from open to endoscopy is when they did an open calculoplasty, they used to remove the bone. Then they used to remove the bone on the medial and the lateral aspect of the calcaneum. The gastrocnemius medial lateral gets attached on the lateral aspects. So when you did open, they always inadvertently damage that insertion of the medial and lateral gastrocnemius in the open procedure. Okay, and they did remove it. That led to a lot of cases where the Achilles tendon became weak, and also there led to a lot of ruptures. So what they found in arthroscopy is that most of the symptoms primarily comes from the medial calcaneum, which is prominent, rather than the central part. So when you do endoscopically, we will be able to delineate between the tendon and the bone and remove the bone which is impinging. So we have to always find, if you remove too much bone, then you are making the Achilles tendon weak, which may lead to rupture. So we always have to find the right balance for the patient. So it honestly, no one can say which is more, which is less. But the thing is, we have to go till the insertion level and check with dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and see if there is any impingement. If you feel any bone is impinging on the tendon, you remove that, provided you don't damage the tendon. The patient should not come back to us in 3 weeks or 4 weeks coming that I have a tendon rupture. That becomes a bad problem for us, right? So it comes with multiple surgeries what we do, but no one can appropriately say all these angles. I've gone through all the literature for these presentations. One paper says these angles are very significant. Other paper says these angles are of no use. So now people who do this on regular basis, they don't use any angles at all. In fact, they don't use the caver at all. So they just go by intraop, see in dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, whether it's impinging or not. They don't even use the caver. But for us starters, or people who do not so often, it is always better to put a caver to just know the depth, how much you're removing the bone. So in essence, what I'm saying is it comes with the feel. So no one can say with some angle that it's this is right, this is wrong. Sorry for my long answer.
Thank you, Ashok. There's one question. I think I just want to ask quickly one thing. What is your threshold to go and do calcanoplasty? Because it's so common incidence is retrocranial bursitis. When do you decide to go for operative indication? And there's one more question in the chat box. In does bursal excision alone is enough? I think that we know the answer for it, so you can tell it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. First question, sir. The treatment is basically clinical. If the patient comes to me on day 1 as 1 month of pain, so we have to put them on how bad the MRI may look or how bad the symptoms may be. We have to try conservative. So because according to literature, 60 to 70% of the people became all right with conservative trial itself. Only 10% of people go to for any surgeries. So we have to try. So any patient who have tried conservative management properly for 6 months, then we offer them surgery. Because any surgery in the Achilles insertion tendon area, the results, even though they are good, the complications are devastating. So if they have any complication, then it becomes very bad. Any wound complication or any tendon rupture, then the morbidity of that is very bad. So it should be a last resort, provided the patient exhausted all the conservative management. That's important.
Thank you.
6 months is my.
Yeah. So the question in the chat box was bursal excision. We don't only do bursal excision. Most of the time, we always also. That is not
Bursal excision is secondary to the postal Haglund's deformity. So just doing the bursal excision, there will be only recurrence of recurrent bursitis. So we have to go in and do the impingement also, remove the impingement also.
So just summarize this. So calcaneal endoplasty is a nice procedure. Never do open. If you have chance to do arthroscopic, do it arthroscopic because it has got a very good outcome. And do on those patients who are failing after 6 months of conservative management.
Yes, sir.
And they have a very good outcome. I have my own personal experience also with some patient, and they are doing very well actually.
Yes.
They found it very, and it's not a difficult procedure to do actually.
Yes,
if you are doing a shoulder arthroscopy, you will definitely do it without any problem because something similar to a subacromial decompression.
Yes, sir.
This is a message to all the audience. Yeah? So we go on to the next talk. Yeah. Next talk is going to be by myself, and I'm going to tell about arthroscopic ankle arthrodesis. Just confirm me whether you are able to see the screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So thank you from Biotech group for giving me the chance to present on arthroscopic ankle arthrodesis. So I'll try to keep it simple. So this is, we all know that ankle arthritis has got degeneration over the talus and the tibial side. And it's an end-stage ankle arthritis where we think about doing either a replacement or a arthrodesis. So arthroplasty has not become much favorable option in ankle arthritis because of it being a weight-bearing joint. And 5 year to 7 year survival rate is not more. It's not more than 5 to 7 year survival. So hence, a lot of people think about doing arthrodesis, which has got a gold standard long-term outcome. Where we do is like post-traumatic ankle osteoarthritis, like this kind of scenario. Or where we have a talus AVN, along with that there is secondary OA of the tibial surface also. It's beyond managing with cartilage regeneration procedure, then we have to go for arthrodesis. And something like rheumatoid arthritis, where there is erosion and you can think about doing arthrodesis. So primary OA is a common indication for doing arthroscopic ankle arthrodesis. So indications to concisely tell is post-traumatic ankle arthritis, talus AVN, secondary OA, inflammatory arthropathy of any nature, and primary osteoarthritis also. So what I have seen in my practice is you get more of post-traumatic and rheumatoid than any other things. So that's where you try to get in patients who are having a good indication for doing arthroscopic ankle arthrodesis. So other things like failed ORAF salvage procedure, failed ankle arthroplasty, chronic ankle instability and arthritis, and sarcode joint is one of the indications also. I have done some case of sarcode joint also doing arthroscopically. What are you trying to achieve in ankle arthrodesis? A good long-term pain relief, use stable platform for achieving mobility. So it is indicated in people who are doing hard work, like manual laborers. It's a good surgery to do. And the most important thing, you have to achieve it in the right position. Good apposition of bone surface is essential. Biology has to be good. Deformity has to be corrected. So the ankle biomechanics you have to understand. Being a hinge joint, fixation in neutral position doesn't cause severe biomechanical sequences. For normal gait requires only 10 degree of ankle dorsiflexion and 20 degree of plantar flexion. Hence, loss of motion just ankle joint is reasonably tolerable with most of the patients. Hence, they don't see much difficulty in walking and doing normal movements. Adjacent joints develop some sort of hyperflexibility to compensate the loss of motion in ankle joint. That is what happens in most of the patients. But this happens only if you fix it in a correct position. If you don't fix it in correct position, like mal position, then if you fix in excess internal rotation, they have more stress in subtalar joint, midfoot joint, and hip and knee joint. So they start developing problems in hip and knee. And similarly, if you fuse it in excess external rotation, foot keeps on rolling over medial side, and the hallux valgus, increased medial side pain in the knee also occurs. If fuse in varus position, then they have stress on the lateral side. So they keep overloading the small joint of the feet. And fusion in plantar flex position makes them walking very difficult. Functional lengthening of the limb, increased stress on midfoot, and hence they have a day-to-day activity problem will happen. So don't fuse in dorsiflex position, then we are putting the heel to weight bear and it leads to overloading and becomes very painful. So what is important is try to orthotics in the correct position, which is going to be very useful on long term. So neutral dorsiflexion, 5 to 10 degrees of external rotation if needed, 5 degrees of hind foot valgus if needed, mostly try to keep it neutral, or 5 millimeter of posterior talar translation may be much useful also. Open arthrodesis is known to have wound complications, soft tissue problems, and longer hospital stay and pain. So ability to correct moderate to severe deformity, severe bone loss, where there is need of bone graft, that's where you go and do the open arthrodesis. Like this kind of scenario where it's very difficult to correct the deformity by others, then you should think about doing an open deformity. This is not uncommon in neuropathic joints. Case selection is very important for doing ankle arthrodesis arthroscopically. But in this kind of scenario where you have only about 10 to 15 degree of deformity going valgusly, and surgical technique is like I just show a case example. 42-year-old presenting with a post-traumatic secondary osteoarthritis, where you need to have some traction for ankle joint to open up. So you can have a stirrup like this kind of thing to traction the ankle joint and open up some ankle space. And we have 4 portals, but the commonly used portal is anterolateral anteromedial portal. Anteromedial portal will be the primary viewing portal to give access to anteromedial joint, medial to tibialis anterior tendon. And through that you can try to clean all the cartilage out. Occasionally I use posterior medial posterolateral portal also. If in case if I need access to the posterior side, then you can use posterior medial posterolateral portal, which is just on the side of Achilles tendon. So the indications for ankle arthrodesis will be osteochondral, lesion of talus, microfracture, synovectomy, resection of anterior tibial talus spurs, excision of os trigonum, and removal of loose bodies. Surgical technique is once you have gone to the, let me just see whether now you are into the ankle joint. Try to take out all the soft tissue which is causing like synovitis, synovial membrane, all this has to be denuded. And then once you have done that, try to scrape the cartilage out with the help of the curette, both on the tibial side, right from medial to lateral, and also from anterior to posterior. And then similarly, try to do it on the talar side also to scrape off all the cartilage. Once you have done it, I tend not to use burr very often. I use it only for smoothing it at the end, not for scraping the cartilage out. So once you have done it, then you have to make sure both tibia and talar surface are equal, so that when you release the traction, they will go and get compressed. And make it smooth on both sides with minimal excision of the underlying subchondral bone, so that you have nice raw area, so that you'll have a good bone opposition. So once it is done, then you release the traction and also take the burr out, then the both will have good approximation. Then what you have to do is you have to do the percutaneous technique of putting cannulated guide wire and then putting 2 or 3 screws. I usually put a 6.5 mm screw, 2 screws, or sometimes 3 screws. So this will help to keep the joint in a position. So the advantage is that having 3 minimal scars like this, so the wound problem is almost near to 0. As you can see some case examples like this, where I have also done Charlie pin for one patient. The downside of Charlie pin is the bone quality has to be reasonably good. Otherwise, that Charlie pin itself, when you're compressing, it can cut through the bone. And this case, like where you have a Charcot joint, where I put a pantalar nail going from the calcaneum. So it's a retrograde calcaneal nailing from calcaneum to talus towards the tibia after denuding the articular surface. So what we have, our experience, 15 patients, candidate screen 13 patients, Charlie pin in 1 patient, and pantalar nail in 1 patient. Indication of post-traumatic in 9, AVN is 1, rheumatoid were 3, osteoarthritis is 1, Charcot joint is 1. So rough time to fusion is 4.8 months. And the AOA score has improved in all the patients, consistently showing that they have good pain improvement. Wound size and problem is always a major concern in arthritis, which you can get away with this arthroscopic technique. Complications, non-union is quoted around 10% in series. In our patients, we did not have any non-union. Lateral plantar nerve injury, superficial peroneal nerve injury, hind foot arthritis have been noticed as one of the complications in ankle arthrodesis arthroscopically. So the advantage is reduced pain, reduced wound problem, length of stay is minimal. Usually they can go home 3 to 4 days time maximum, and complications are either little or minimal. Literature supports very much about arthroscopic ankle arthrodesis, showing that they have better clinical score, fewer in complications, short hospital stay, and less blood loss, and no difference in union rate or reoperation date. So, which says that it has got a unique advantage of having all the mini invasive surgery. And the largest series I can say is open versus arthroscopic ankle arthrodesis. There is 7,322 open arthrodesis compared to 1,152 arthroscopic, showing significant difference in outcome in patients who are having ankle arthroscopic arthrodesis. And subtalar arthrodesis much commoner than midfoot arthrodesis in on a follow-up group of patients. So this one is comparing on 29 patients of open versus 50 arthroscopic. Time to fusion was around 192 days in open. In arthroscopic, 146 days. Mean length of stay is less. Union occurred in 98% compared to 83% in our open procedure. 9 complications in our open and 4 complications in ankle arthroscopic arthrodesis, which all indicates that arthroscopic arthrodesis has got a significant better outcome in terms of symptomatic relief and also in terms of reducing complication. So it is becoming a time-tested procedure now. Doing arthroscopy has immense advantages in terms of wound problems, less complication, good union rate, less pain, less hospital stay, less blood loss. Surgical technique is not difficult for any arthroscopic surgeon as it involves predominantly denuding the articular surface. Thank you very much. Let me see, is there any questions in the chat box? Hey, somebody asked about using a ACL or PCL jig to help with screw placement in arthrodesis. No, I don't use ACL jig or PCL jig for that. But what I use is C-arm. That's what we need to make sure one of your screw goes anteriorly, one of your screw goes posteriorly, the talus body, and one screw I try from medial to proximal medial to another one trying from proximal lateral. So, and we try to catch on the body of the talus. So I don't usually. Does any of you use ACL or PCL jig for arthrodesis?
No, sir, I don't.
No, I don't think there. You don't need to.
Yes, sir. Like you said, sir, screw placement is more important to get a uniform compression.
Yes, yeah.
Screw position and the position of the angle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is no other questions.
No other questions. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So just to summarize, I will just tell arthroscopic arthrodesis has got a definitely better outcome than open arthrodesis. So if you are capable of doing it, please go through it. That's what it will be a good outcome for most of the patient. I think just one question has come in that. So, sir, do you tighten the screws alternatively? Not really, because you don't come across that kind of situation where you are having less approximation. I tighten it almost one by one. You don't feel like there is a need of doing the alternative like that.
Yeah, there is one more question, sir. Can you do subtalar arthrodesis arthroscopically?
You can do it, but you have to put subtalar scope, and you can do subtalar denudation of cartilage, and you can do subtalar arthrodesis arthroscopically also. You can even do combined also, ankle and subtalar together with doing patellar name. The procedure which I showed, the patient who is having Charcot joint, he already has got talus is fully almost disintegrated. So you are almost gone to subtalar joint level to do arthrodesis. It is possible, yes. It is, yeah. So if there are no other questions, I think we have completed all the questions. So
Yes, sir.
let's go on to the next talk. So which is going to be by Dr. Rufus Vasantraj from Chennai to share his experience on lateral ligament reconstruction through arthroscopically. Rufus, are you ready to share your screen?
I'm ready, sir. You're able to see my
Please
screen?
go ahead. Do any case need bone graft? Yes. The answer for that is my cases have not needed bone graft because the deformities were all around the 10 to 15 degree deformities. You don't need bone graft. But I have done fibular osteotomy for one of the patient to get bone approximation. So in open procedures, we tend to use a lot of bone graft and all. But here, most of the time, the height difference that you get is not even less than half to 1 centimeter. Most of the people will manage. So I have not used bone graft in my patients. Rufus, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll start, sir. Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Rufus. I'm basically the head of arthroscopy and sports medicine at Rela Institute and Medical Center. It's a nice opportunity for me to talk on a very common topic, basically an arthroscopic lateral ligament reconstruction. We are mainly going to focus on ankle sprain. It's a very, very common topic. So first, I would like to go in depth about the anatomy. So looking at the anatomy, as we all know, there are three main ligaments: anterior talofibular ligament, calcaneofibular ligament, and posterior talofibular ligament. So these are three main ligaments which are involved in an ankle sprain, out of which ATFL is the main one. You definitely need to know a little bit more anatomy because in reconstruction, you need to be very precise. So anatomical landmarks are very, very important. When you're looking at the ATFL, the origin is around 8.4 mm, superior or proximal and anterior to the tip of the lateral malleolus. Similarly, its insertion is around 13.8 mm, proximal and anterior to the apex of the lateral process of the talus. This gives a rough idea about your anchor placements. So next is CFL, the calcaneofibular ligament. The origin is around 5 mm, superior and anterior to the inferior tip of the lateral malleolus, and the insertion is around 17 mm posterior and 5.9 mm superior to the peroneal tubercle. Then the last one, PTFL, the posterior talofibular ligament. The origin is around 7.8 mm, superior and posterior to the inferior tip of the lateral malleolus, and the insertion is around 6.8 mm, anterior and superior to the posterolateral talar tubercle. This is a nice article which was published in Custa a few years back. So basically the number one which is marked here is the superior fascicle of the ATFL. And number two is the inferior fascicle of the ATFL. And number three is the calcaneofibular ligament, CFL. So the inferior fascicle of the ATFL and the calcaneofibular ligament together form what is called as the lateral fibro-talocalcaneal complex. And another important part is that we have to understand that as we go from lateral to medial, if you look at this complex, more medially, the inferior fascicle of the ATFL is continuous with the PTFL. And the studies also showed that almost half the patients, like 50% of the patients, also had the superior fascicle, which was in continuous with the PTFL. So I'll explain why these anatomies are very important later. Now coming to the history and clinical examination, the most common mechanism of injury is 1 minute. Okay. The most common mechanism of injury is a forced inversion of the foot in plantar flexion. And as we all know, most of the times it's only the ATFL, actually the ATFL superior fascicle, which is the first or the only ligament to sustain injury. As we keep moving or the injury more severe, then we involve the CFL also. So basically when the complex, which I already explained, the lateral fibro-talocalcaneal complex is involved, and as it spreads more medially, you also get involved of the PTFL. So an ankle sprain can anywhere start from the just a superior fascicle of the ATFL and can go up to the PTFL also. So what are the common symptoms? The common symptoms are, as we all know, swelling, bruising. The patient feels it very tender to touch. And some patients do come with a classical symptom of instability also. And looking at the signs, I think this is a gold standard test which has been done for ages, anterior drawer test. It's very easy to perform. The foot is slightly plantar flexed. We stabilize the tibia with one hand. We cup the calcaneus and pull the hind foot forward. And we look at the increased translation. So normally we compare it to the opposite ankle. If the translation is too much, we assume that the CFL is also torn along with the ATFL. What I would like to stress is that this is a nice article. It's a level 2 evidence published in Custa in 2018. This is something which I do for the last couple of years. This is a reverse anterolateral Roy test, and I find it to be more easier to perform, and also it gives more better results. It is more classical. I'll explain why. So here the patient lies supine in a couch with the knee a little bit flexed so that it can facilitate plantar flexion. The heel is pressed on the bed. So you actually ask the patient to press the heel on the bed also. And now you keep the ankle around 10 to 15 degrees of plantar flexion. You keep your fingers around the lateral aspect of the talar bone, a little bit anterior to the lateral malleolus. And you actually push the distal tibia backward. When compared to the regular anterior Roy test, this is more easier because you're actually pushing the tibia towards gravity, which is much easier rather than the anterior Roy test, which you are trying to pull the ankle against gravity. And also a tibia is a much bigger and much easier organ to bone to push down. So it's like almost like doing a posterior latchman instead of the proximal part of the tibia, doing it in the distal part of the tibia. So this is more easier to perform, and this more classically elicits the Roy test. Translation. And you have the talar tilt test. This is mainly for the CFL. You stabilize the tibia with one hand and you invert the affected foot, and also meanwhile palpate the lateral aspect of the joint to estimate the degree of tilt. And you always compare it with the opposite side. All these tests are based on the opposite side because unilaterally it's very difficult to say. And also some patients might have generalized laxity. Now coming to the investigations, we generally start with X-rays, regular X-rays like AP, lateral, mortise views. In addition, stress X-rays are very important. If you look at a stress X-ray, when there's an anterior Roy test done on an X-ray, there's almost around 5 to 10 mm of translation. And usually it's around 3 mm of translation when compared to more than the opposite ankle is also considered positive. Stress ultrasounds are very, very good, but unfortunately it's a user-dependent thing. In my institution, we have a good interventional radiologist. So I do send them for ultrasound also, much cost-effective and also a dynamic study. So the stress by resting ratio, if it's more than 1.2, it classically shows that there's an ATFL tear. And of course, everybody knows that MRI is something which is very commonly done. You can look at the tear. As you see on the right picture, it's a classical tear of the ATFL. The problem with MRI is that the sensitivity and specificity is a little bit on the lower side in ATFL tear diagnosis. And it's even more lower if you want to look for partial ATFL tears. So this is a nice article which talks about an indirect sign. So basically the number 1 is the ATFL and number 2 is a PTFL. Since they are almost identical ligaments in one plane, some axial cuts, exactly at some axial cuts, you will find that they are parallel to each other. If you look at the ATFL and PTFL angle, which is normally around 75 degrees, if it's more like around 80 to 90 degrees, then it's actually an indirect sign for an indication for an ATFL tear. But as we all know, the gold standard or the only way to really show is the arthroscopy. So this is a tab where I'm comparing with the MRI and the arthroscopy picture. This is from the fibula side, this is a mid-substance tab, and this is a talar side. As we know in abroad countries, diagnostic arthroscopy is a day care procedure. So it's like any other like a diagnosis, like an MRI or like ultrasound. They do it and just check. But unfortunately, India is more like a surgical procedure. So it's not possible to always keep diagnostic arthroscopy as the investigation tool unless we go for a surgery. Now coming to the treatment part, basically, so far looking at the clinical and radiological things, we can have a type 3 or totally grade 3 tears. So grade 1 is actually a partial tear of the ATFL where the patient has minimal loss of function. Usually they don't have instability. Sometimes they do have micro instability, which is very crucial in athletes especially, which we can't ignore. When it's a grade 2 tear, it's actually a complete tear of ATFL and a partial tear of CFL. That is a definite loss of function and there's an instability. When there's a complete tear of ATFL and CFL, there's a severe loss of function. In fact, patients find it even difficult to weight bear, and there's a severe instability also. Regarding the instability, I would like to stress that instability is not just mechanical. There are two parts for it, a mechanical ankle instability and a functional ankle instability. Mechanical ankle instability, as everyone knows, there's a laxity and excessive motion of the joint. There's definitely structural damage to the ligaments. But functional ankle instability is very important because when you treat it conservatively, if you're not addressing the functional part, you always have a problem. So there's a reduction in proprioception, neuromuscular control, postural control, as well as in muscle strength. Now looking at the conservative treatment, normally if it's a partial tear of a ATFL with no instability, yes, conservative treatment is a treatment of choice. When there's a micro instability, if it's a high demand individual like an athlete, I do suggest a surgical option and also explain about the conservative trial also. So the conservative trial is very, very important. What we actually do is that I divide it into totally 3 phases. And I don't divide it based on the time limit. I divide it on how they are functionally improving. For example, many people just put a brace or a walking boot and say after 6 weeks, you can remove it and be normal. So I don't prefer that because on a long run, it doesn't help. You need to focus on a lot of small things. So phase 1 is mainly rest, ice packs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Weight bearing is tolerated. I normally give a walking boot, which helps in healing and as well as ambulation. So once the patient is pain-free on clinical examination also, then only I advance to the phase 2. When looking at the phase 2, we work mainly on the peroneal and dorsiflexion strengthening and Achilles tendon strengthening. The use of the braces I continue at this phase also, and I also prevent plantar flexion exercises because that can cause injury. And next stage, we go only when there's a full recovery of a full ROM and almost 80% of strength is recovered. Then I go to the phase 3. So there's no time limit, which I'm trying to specify because we always have a 6 weeks time limit for everything. It doesn't work that way. On phase 3, the concentration is more on proprioception, agility, and endurance exercises and return to full strength. Since I see a lot of ankle sprains in athletes and sports people, I always take it very slowly and make sure that they get back to their normal routine as early as possible. So use of brace and the phase 3, I slowly discontinue. Now coming to the surgical intervention, the common question is always asked is open versus arthroscopy. I would not say open is a bad procedure because for ATFL ligament reconstructions, open is a pretty decent procedure. And I used to do peroneus, I always used to do in the beginning stages with the peroneus longus. So peroneus longus don't need to take the full tendon. As we all know, since I do that for revision ACLs also, I use a lot of peroneus longus tendons. I know that it's a very big tendon, so the big tendon is not necessary. It's just a part of the tendon is enough because the tunnels which you're going to drill on the tibia, on the fibula and the talus are going to be relatively small. So you can, it's like a split graft. So you once you take the graft and then you drill tunnels on the fibular side and the talus and then fix it with screws. So we can use a screw which is like, usually these screws are around 4 to 5 mm and they have a maximum length of around 10 to 12 mm. So Sofix PK screw is a pretty decent screw which I use for this. And in addition, always reconstruction can be combined with the repair if there are enough tissues to repair. Now coming to the point of whether arthroscopic repair as it got any superiority or is that only open should be done. Generally, arthroscopic procedures have a very good favorable outcomes in short term. This is a nice systematic article. Both the articles say that in the short term, definitely yes. On long run, almost a similar results with arthroscopy and open procedures. And recent studies show that the complication rates are not so high because initially when ankle arthroscopy was introduced, there was always a pushback saying that ankle arthroscopy has got a lot of complications. You have a high chance of injuring the dorsalis pedis, superficial peroneal, saphenous vein, all those factors, and the tendons also. But over a period of time, they also understood that it's just a matter of time. If you are doing an ankle arthroscopy properly, the complication rates are pretty less. So definitely an arthroscopic procedure carries an added advantage when compared to an open procedure. Now coming to the ankle arthroscopy, I just will give a few slides about some recent advances. Most of the times it's done with traction, but there's a nice article where they also mentioned that the picture on the left is an ankle and dorsiflexion. So ankle and dorsiflexion actually opens up the anterior space better than the ankle and plantar flexion with traction because ankle and plantar flexion traction opens the joint, but the anterior compartment actually a little bit collapses. This is a regular how I do a scopy. I look at the 7-point, which I was taught by Dr. David Rajan sir. So the one is actually the ligament which you're seeing, the one portal is the inferior or the distal vesicle of the anterior tibiofibular ligament. And once you come to the lateral gutter, you see the superior part of the superior vesicle of the ATFL and the fibula. And number 3 is the medial talar neck. Number 4 is the lateral. And number 5, you go to the medial gutter. You see the deep part of the deltoid ligament. And also you see the tibia. And number 6 is the tibial, medial tibial angle. And number 7 is basically the anterior part of the joint. So this is a nice arthroscopic classification. but this classification can be done only with the help of arthroscopy. So you will get an idea only when you put the scope. So basically it has got totally 5 types, 2A and 2B is there. So type 1 is nothing but attenuation with the loss of tension. And type 2A is medial part alone detachment. And type 2B, is proximal part detachment. All these 3 things are very important because these 3 things can cause micro instability, which plays a very important role in high demand athletes or sports people. And then type 3 is total detachment and type 4 is resorption. All these types ideally require repair or reconstruction depending on the tissue quality. Now coming to the next question, whether we should repair or reconstruct. It's a very tricky question. We normally use the regular dictum of looking at the quality of the ligament. So if it's moderate, also sometimes the repair alone might not be sufficient, because if you don't take the bites properly, slowly you lose the remnant of the tissues also, which are of decent quality. The next is the poor content. So the arthroscopic repair is the next one which we are going to look at. So I'll just show you some videos or pictures of how it is done. So the one is nothing but the fibula, and number 2 is the talus. So once you go to the lateral gutter, you clear the soft tissues. And once you clear the soft tissues, you see 2 important structures. The number 3 is the CFL and number 4 is the peroneus tendons. So I first take a bite on the CFL. This is a patient where it had on clinical as well as with MRI, both ATFL, superior vesicle, inferior vesicle and CFL were injured. So you take a bite in the CFL and then you take a bite in the inferior vesicle of the ATFL. And then you take a bite, the number 1 is actually the superior vesicle of the ATFL. So this is which I did with a knotless anchor. So for knotless anchors, you normally take the bites first, and then you can use a mini Wimfix around a 3.5 mm knotless anchor, where you load the bites and you put the anchors. Normally 2 anchors are preferred. So the first one which I did is for the CFL and the inferior vesicle of ATFL. I took it together because, as we all know, it's a one complex. So that is on the inferior part of the fibula. I put the first anchor. It is on the anterior surface of the fibula, about 1 centimeter from the tip. The next anchor is another 1 centimeter above. So that is for the superior vesicle of the ATFL. So this is the final picture of how it is after reconstructed. So literature is always in support of using 2 anchors, because 2 anchors definitely have a biomechanically more stable construct. And this is another picture which I wanted to show of my case where I did with knotted anchor. So for knotted anchor, obviously you have to put the anchors first. So I put both the anchors and then you can take the bite. This was the initial days when I used to do the arthroscopic rostrum gauge modification. So basically I made a small 2 centimeter incision in the distal part of the inferior extensor retinaculum. So basically this incision will be around the peroneal tubercle over the sinus tarsi. So you take bites to the inferior extensor retinaculum. So we take it from anterior to posterior. So the first bite anterior, take it to the anterolateral portal outside and pass one of the stitches, one of the threads, which is from the superior anchor. That is the anchor which is proximal. Then again, come a little bit posterior to the first bite, go to the inferior external retinaculum and take the one more thread from the top part, from the top anchor. So once you take it like this from anterior to posterior, all the 4 anchors are taken out, then you can repair it. Now coming to the question of whether knotless or not anchors, the literature says that this is a very recent study, a few months back, both had similar biomechanical functional results. So whichever you're comfortable with, you can actually use. There's no specific indication that you have to use a knotted anchor or a knotless anchor. Now coming to the reconstruction part, as I already explained, the open reconstruction of the peroneus longus tendon, reconstruction can be done with grafts. And always the results are more in favor of repair with reconstruction, because repair alone, sometimes if you're not good in assessing the quality of the tissue, you might end up with a re-tear. So reconstructions definitely have a better functional activity levels, especially for sports people. And Zarda article was showing the FAA score was better, the 5-year follow-up, high technical activity scores when compared to just repair. Now, reconstruction definitely produces a similarly favorable outcome, high patient satisfaction, high activity levels, and less revision surgeries or no revision surgeries. That's what these literatures say. Now coming to this reconstruction, this is a nice biomechanical study where they looked at 3 things. One is just a repair, one is a repair with a suture anchor, other one is a repair along with the internal bracing with a suture tape. They found that internal bracing with a suture tape was actually more superior. I'm trying to stress this because sometimes I do also just a suture tape augmentation and no grafts. Because graft, sometimes you have to make a really small graft because of these smaller tunnels required. A suture tape augmentation, definitely it's much faster to do. And you don't need an external bracing because you've already put an internal bracing. So obviously rehabilitation is much faster. And definitely I found that this was more superior when using a graft, because sometimes the grafts can fail, but this is more like a tape, which is not going to tear so easily. So all you require is just 2 anchors, a knotless anchor, 3.5 knotless anchors, and a biofiber tape to do an internal bracing. So you make a drill in the talus, put a load an anchor with the tape, and then use another anchor on the fibula side, and your internal bracing is complete. It's relatively a very, very simple and straightforward procedure. Of course, there's a big controversy. People do still feel that grafts work better and it's more biological. But somehow I felt that the biofiber tapes or the Rennie fiber tapes, they're also more of biological and they actually will really well. It even avoids the use of external bracings after surgeries. Now coming to the most important part, rehabilitation. So rehabilitation, the early rehabilitation phase, it's mainly focused on increasing your lower extremity strength, increasing your range of motion, increasing the foot and ankle strength, improve balance and proprioception, and also to get a proper gait. Most of the patients have a problem with the gait after surgeries. They try to unload the ankle, so the gait abnormalities has to be corrected. Now coming to the late rehabilitation phase, it's more on balance and proprioception and function testing. And then return to sport phase, very important. The phase 3, I keep it only for sports people. For other people, I stop with the phase 2. So the phase 3 is, the main goal is to return to a running or agility like zigzag and all those things, and sports specific activity. I have a sports physiotherapist, so we do a sports specific drill and check whether they are fit to get back to sports. Usually it takes around 6 to 9 months for them to properly get back to a full-fledged sporting activity. So on conclusion, I would say anatomy is very, very important. A proper knowledge of the ligaments is very important because reconstruction is purely dependent on that. Repair also, sometimes if you're not proper with the suture anchor placement, it might fail. I felt or I feel that the reverse anterolateral rotatus is more sensitive also. And always in MRI, look for indirect signs because MRI sensitivity and specificity is quite low. So just looking at the MRI, it's not a good idea to go for a surgery. Conservative treatment definitely requires a proper physio protocol because most of the people, most of the orthopedicians just give a cast or brace for 6 weeks and then don't follow any protocol for physiotherapy, looking at proprioception and other things. Definitely repair requires minimum 2 anchors. And when you repair with augmentation, I feel it's quite superior because you can't always rely on the quality of the repair tissue. Internal bracing with suture tape augmentation can be considered instead of grafts, and post-op rehabilitation is very, very important. And thanks for all my teachers.
Thank you, Dr. Rufus. See, is there any question in the chat box?
If I may, can I ask the question, sir?
Yeah.
The thing is, Rufus, it's a very good talk. The thing is, when you decide the patient requires a repair or when you go for a reconstruction. So because what I feel is reconstruction, here you said with the tape. So usually in literature, the reconstruction is based on a reconstruction tendon, where the ligament is deficient, they do a reconstruction. So when do you decide on repair and when do you feel the patient needs a reconstruction?
Okay. I take a call only after my diagnostic arthroscopy. So I give the patient both the options. I tell them that depending on the intraoperative findings, I'm going to take the call. So when I go inside, when I see the tissue quality, if I feel the tissue quality is not satisfactory, or sometimes when you take the bites, you might lose a part of the tissue. So you should be very careful. So in that situations, I always feel that augmentation is necessary. And I've done in this ATFL alone, I have done different kinds of procedures because I always tried a lot of new procedures when it came. I felt that most of the times the tendons, it is like a little bit more bulkier in that area. And you have to really make a very small tendon. As long as a quite big tendon, it might have 8 to 9 mm thickness. So you have to make a real small tendon. Of course, you can take a hamstring, gracilis, a lot of things are described in literature. So many tendons have been described. But these tendons, they are more like interference screw technique only. So even in ACL, we have one side interference, the other side the suspensory fixation. So here also we can of course do it. You can use an endo button or a tight rope on one side. But most of the times it's more easier to put a bio screw or a compression screw. So I felt over a period of time, again, suture tape augmentation was much easier because I started doing it for revision ACLs, for MPFLs and all those things. And I felt that suture tape augmentation had a quite good, reasonable outcome in my hands. So now I slowly started moving from tendon to tape. I repair it, I put internal bracing, I'm happy
So
about
what
it.
you're saying is if the ligament is deficient, is deficient and it's poor quality, say you get away with just putting suture tape, repairing whatever poor tissue is there, repairing that, and just putting. You feel that tape will work because long term, what we need is that if there's a ligament is deficient there, then we have to replace that ligament with a biological ligament, right? I think you agree. That's what we do. So if with the same example for MPFL, if we're going to do an MPFL reconstruction, we augment it with an, but we don't just entirely replace the ligament with just a tape alone. That's what I want to. So if you're poor, you feel in ankle that just tape is enough.
See, definitely it's a very sensitive topic, and recent studies are coming up, only tape is enough. And MPFL also, I have done only tape for few patients, which I felt that, in fact, one of the cases got infected for some other reason, or chronic diabetic, all those things. When I opened up, after 6 weeks, actually, I found the tissues were contracted around the tape. So automatically, it's not just the tape which is working. All the tissues, capsule, everything around it automatically gets contracted to that stage after few months. So I think it should work, and tape definitely has got a much stronger constrict.
Maybe you should publish that detail what you have for MPFL. That's a news to me. That just using a tape alone for MPFL reconstruction, that's a news point. Okay.
I think Ashok, the point to ponder is tape is not a biological thing.
That's what I'm trying to highlight.
What you can, I know what you are trying to mean. What we can do is you can try to impregnate your graft along with the tape. That acts like an augmentation.
That's what I wanted to make was, if you're doing a repair, maybe in this classification like mild, moderate, and severe. When in the moderate case, when you repair and you feel not happy, then you put a tape. I understand that. But when the tissue is poor and there is no tissue for you to repair at all, that's where you come and do a ligament reconstruction. So in those cases, when there is need to do a ligament, because there is a lot of joint forces go through the ankle. I am not sure whether just putting a tape alone, where the tissue quality is poor. That's why there are multiple procedures they have been described where they use a Gresley's tendon. Using a hamstring in our population may not be that good, but we can use a Gresley's tendon. We moved a single tunnel in the fibula and two tunnels, one in the talus anterior and posterior, reconstructing the ATFL and CFL. That was what it has been described as a ligament reconstruction, where it ligamentizes over a period of time and recreates the ATFL and the CFL. That's what they were. But I am not sure, and I will be a little apprehensive to use just a tape alone to do a ligament reconstruction where there is no tissue at all. Maybe when you have done a repair, where in a Bromstrom procedure, when you are doing double-twisted ligament, instead of putting an extensor retinaculum over it to augment the repair, I may use a tape if it will make my company counterparts happy. Putting the tape and putting screws way happy, I'll do that. But the extensor retinaculum works well. So for a mild, moderate, a Bromstrom procedure works very well. But in a ligament reconstruction, just putting a tape, maybe if Rufus publishes that MPFL study where he has done just the
but for ATFL, I have not done only tape. Of course, I take the extensor retinaculum also into it. In MPFL, I just did a couple of cases, out of which one actually got infected, as I said before. When I went in, it was already a very stable knee. So I basically felt that the tissues around it also got contracted accordingly.
Nothing against you. My thing is, I'm just putting tape alone. That's my personal. Unless I have more literature on that, where a ligament place where a ligament has to be there can be done with purely a tape alone. If there is still a more literature comes into that, I will not be keen on doing that. That's why my personal opinion.
There are a few literatures. I'll send it to you across.
Okay.
There are a few literatures, but it's still on the very early phase.
Okay.
It's a controversial topic.
Okay, I'll not do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think your argument is definitely acceptable because recently we had one case of patella dislocation in a syndromic patient.
Okay.
The patella was so much subluxing. We went to go for just ligament reconstruction.
Okay.
But on seeing that patient, I did like whip stitching the whole fiber tape for the ligament throughout from this end to that end. So that you are acting like an augmentation of the ligament on not just a natural ligament.
Okay.
It will give additional strength like that.
Okay.
So the similar way of thinking, what you are saying is for also for lateral ligament, we should do like gracilis along with whip stitching with the fiber tape.
Yes.
That may help like an
Maybe
augmentation.
additional, yeah.
Biology and
Augmentation, yes, sir. Augmentation, I'm all for it. But that alone as a ligament, I'm not. I'm still not convinced.
I don't know what the literature says about it. Just isolated ligament.
For ankle,
The patient will tell
it's augmented only. It's not just a tape, but MTFL, I said. That's
Well, the thing is, if in a case where you said ATFL reconstruction in a very poor tissue, the tissue is already very poor. So there is no tissue for you to repair. That's where the ligament reconstruction comes into play.
definitely we have to use
The reason what you gave for not doing a reconstruction there is that the peroneal tendon is too bulky, and also the thing is the hamstrings are too bulky for that. That's the only because you never in your study you said you have done a reconstruction with a hamstring or a peroneal tendon. That's why I wanted to highlight that.
No.
Sorry.
I think there is one more question in the chat box.
Yes, sir.
One answer is biological fixation better or synthetic repair better? That's what we are discussing so far, isn't it? Yeah. So it answers the question.
So I think we can take the final message as try to do a biological repair, and if situations demand, we can do a synthetic augmentation.
Exactly. But my take home message is basically like all repairs better to augment it. Most of the times, unless until it's an acute repair, most of the times patients don't come to an acute phase, and most of the literature is also first 6 weeks they try to treat ankle sprains conservatively. So by the time it comes to us, it might not be in a repairable stage, and if you are augmenting it along with it, it's always better. So
Of course, that's it. Not just an isolated synthetic repair. You can augment.
no. Yeah, you have to augment.
Great. Nice talk.
Very good talk. Very good. Extensive talk. Very nice.
Thank you. I think it is a new talk and it was an excellent talk, Rufus. Really enjoyed it. I think to summarize it, we come across a lot of patients coming with lateral ligament injury. Not everyone needs surgery. All of them go for conservative management for October 6 weeks or up to even 3 months also. Those who are fearing conservative management, then you should really think about this option. And arthroscopic option is really attractive, and using a direct repair is okay along with augmentation of the tape, or you should think about reconstruction. That is even more better. That's what the message is, isn't it? Yeah. That's the message for the audience. So there is one more question in the chat box. Let's see what's happening there. No, they're just saying thank you. Fine. So I think we all did good job. We're coming to the conclusion of the session. I would like to personally thank all the 3 speakers, Dr. Abdul Ghafoor, Dr. Ashok Selvaraj, and Dr. Rufus Vasantraj for spending your time in our session today here, especially during pandemic. Thank you for spending your time here. Okay. And also I thank the biotech team for organizing the event. So with this, we come to the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Hello? Okay.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye bye.
It's 5:55.
Yes.
So shall we leave?
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam, for your wonderful support always. And it's our honor and privilege to have you always on our platform. And thank you, Dr. Rufus, Dr. Abdul, and Dr. Ashok Islam. So thank you so much, all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
you, sir. Take care.